Southampton Town takes care of 11 cemeteries in the town. When a cemetery is no longer active, no longer taking people in as customers, the town has an obligation as a municipality for the state of New York to take those cemeteries over. About 2011, Sunday Schermeyer, who was the town clerk here of Southampton Town, had a very wise idea to treat headstones as historical documents. And just like the documents that we store in our town vault, they're just as important. And for some women, although there is one exception in this cemetery, that don't, most women, this is the only record they have of their existence, depending on when they lived.
Wow.
So they're very, very important. They're also very important because of the nature of headstones and what they're made of. So we have these white ones are all marble. They stand for great test of time. The brownstone that you're standing in front of, I think this one is really in great shape. But they unfortunately are porous stone, and after a while, you can see this crack right here. After a while, when it rains and water gets inside, fluctuation of temperatures, the face ends up falling off, and then we lose everything that was on this document. So fortunately, we live in an era that we can take photographs of everything. We have the DAR records from the 30s when they came through, before a lot of more damage was done. That's almost 100 years ago. So we have their records, and we keep that all on our town website, which is Southampton Town Cemeteries. It's hgsdb.info, but you can just Google Southampton Town Cemeteries. So all 11 cemeteries that we own are on that site, plus all the privately owned cemeteries, whether they're 35. Throughout the town, there are 35 cemeteries. 11 of those the town takes care of. The others are all still privately owned. Some are still active, some are not, but they're private. So we're trying to get everybody in the town kind of on the same page with the town and what we're doing in these 11, so that in 100 years, the next town historian, not that I'm going to live another 100 years, but the next town historian will have all the records, they'll have a fresh start of what exists in those privately owned cemeteries now, doing it the same way the town is doing with the 11, because eventually the big cemetery in Southampton, the Slavonic Cemetery, that's going to get full too, and the town is going to have to take it over. And so this way we get everything we get recorded. The town knows about every headstone, every stone document in the town. That way we're ahead of the game going forward, because it's very important for genealogy, as we're all here. What I guess Genealogy Day used to be called Descendants Day, which I thought was kind of a cool way to look at it. They offer a lot of information. You can find out the status of a person, married, unmarried, religious. Those are all things that you can find here on the headstones. The bigger the stone, the big monument, that's wealth. Just like today, people would go into debt over burying them. We kind of followed all the norms from Queen Victoria during the Victorian era. So when people died, you kind of went all out and paid for headstones and all the different types of funerary objects that you would have to show how much you care for it. This is a truly typical 18th century cemetery. It was opened in actually the land was bought in 1712, and I was just doing research about something else, and I found out that the gentleman that owned this piece of property, his name was Caleb Heathcote. He inherited it from a cousin. Turns out he was the mayor of New York City from 1711 to 1716, I think. And he owned this piece of property. He never lived out here. There was a dwelling on the property. He sold it to the town trustees in 1712. And they didn't start interring anybody here until 1721. And we know that because his headstone there's a headstone over there that we'll take a look at, and it tells us that he's the first person interred here. Let's see. So we have 670 headstones in this cemetery alone. Some of these headstones, they fall over. There's a headstone that we just found that had fallen over. Did he already put it back up? I think it's over by those green flags. It looks like I think he put it already back up for me. So we have a conservator that works for us. He likes to remain anonymous and come and do his work quietly. So he does all that. He's done an incredible job with his burying ground. It's really quite remarkable. So that can...
Well, just the number of people that are buried here are much more than the 680
Yeah, the
stones.
670 headstones that you see, there are other people that are buried here. Their headstones have gone missing, they've fallen over, they're under, you know, a good amount of soil over the years. And we're 300 years beyond that, so a lot can happen in 300 years, especially when some of these headstones get defaced. It's a typical cemetery. It is orientated facing east, which for the Christian belief is that your just, you know, your name and everything that would be on your epitaph that would be on your headstone is here. Most of these headstones have footstones. These footstones would normally be back here, but we've moved them. They've gotten moved, so when they mow the lawns here, they don't get destroyed. So it's a compromise. They've all been pushed closer to the main headstone so they don't get damaged. So the normal footstone would be here. Your body would be, your head would be here, and you are orientated east. For the second coming, you'd be rising to the sunrise, and that's what that meant. As things changed, room wasn't as available as all this extra space. We don't have any of that anymore. So those traditions and ways of doing things have kind of changed. You kind of bury people wherever you have space and stuff like that. And by the end of the 19th century, cemeteries became parks. Like Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn opened up, and that was to get people out of the city, kind of like a park-like atmosphere. You could take your carriage and you could ride around and have a picnic and visit your loved ones. So there was kind of the same idea. Cemeteries here, Savonic has the same kind of thing where the layout is roads and little curves and circular areas. So it was more park-like. So it changed the orientation of how you were buried. It was not as important. So most of these headstones, I mean, they're in beautiful condition. I wanted to start over. Where's Mr. Pelletreau? Okay, I'm going to bring everybody over here. So we have marble, as I mentioned, is a great stone. The newer stones are granite. This gray one here, William Russell, that's granite. And then the brownstones, and then we have some slates. This is the slate stone. And they do really well. Most of the brownstones and slate are the oldest headstones we have here. So this is, I'm going to come down this way. I'll try to stay in the sun if you can. This is William S. Pelletreau, and he is somewhat of a hero. In 1860s and 70s, he transcribed all the town records by candlelight and a magnifying glass. I have the luxury of having it all digitized, and I can zoom in and I can read some of this old English. So that's, he was a town historian and town clerk. He is a descendant of Elias Pelletreau, who was our first silversmith, goldsmith here in town. Does everybody know his little shop that's right on Main Street? So that his building was preserved. And I need to put these on so I can read here. So, so this is telling you he rescued from destruction records of his native town and preserved its history for future generations. He died with faith in God and love to men. So this is telling a little bit about him. Because I know what he did, I know exactly what he's talking about. So this is kind of a really interesting story. Actually, letting it be known that he was the one responsible for taking care of the town records. And rather than have them be in everybody's attic and be destroyed, he gathered it all together and put it. And you can go through all his records online. The town has all 8 books, record books, from 1639, I think is the earliest record in there, all the way up to 1927. And those are all digitized, and you can search them. They're all PDFs and OCR, and you can read them, and they're really great. So here's a perfect example here. If you want to keep coming, this is a perfect example of a brownstone that sadly has lost its face. We were lucky enough recently to get his military honors back. This is John Pelletreau, and we were able to figure out, we can't see now that he's John Pelletreau, but we're able to do the VAR from the 1930s, and we found him, we know what date he died, so we were able to put cemetery honors was bought at a yard sale by a town historian that we'll talk about Pelletreau, but we won't talk about the town historian that somebody bought it at his yard sale years and years and years ago. So they came to me and said, we have this, and then it turned out to be the gentleman whose headstone we didn't know which Pelletreau this was. So now it's finally back home. And this is another interesting thing to do. Back after the Civil War, so many people were lost that people wanted to honor those that served. So they started putting these markers by headstones. And now, since World War I, you'll see flags denoting who served, men and women who served in the armed forces. So when they did it in the 1860s, 1865, after Civil War was over, then they realized, well, we should really go back and do all our veterans. So they started, the Grand Army Republic started making these for all our veterans, which is wonderful to know if you go to a cemetery to see the flags or see these markers. Unfortunately, these markers tend to go missing, like I mentioned. Turns up at a yard sale. And there's also these little discs that are put on the headstone. We don't really recommend these because it's playing with the integrity of the headstone. And you can see this one has a nice little crevasse here, and that's where the water gets in. And then when it freezes and expands, the whole thing falls over. So, okay, so let's go down and yeah, those are footstones. Yeah, that's to show the orientation. So everybody nowadays walks here and thinks they're standing on the person, but they're on the other side.
Good to know.
Good to know, right?
This side, this one.
Yeah, but these got all moved so that they didn't get hit by the.
But the body's still under there.
Yes, we're all. Well, we could be walking on many people here whose headstones have been missing because they wouldn't have. They didn't. Nothing was frivolous. They didn't waste space. So there's probably a good portion of people that are buried within this area as well. There is a little road that you can see toward the center that comes down for carts. When this was originally laid out. We have the oldest burying ground in the town is on Little Plains. Is everybody familiar with the old burying ground? Mm-hmm. So between Little Plains and South Main Street, it's tucked in between James and Herrick and Post Lane. There's a cemetery in there. It's just 2 acres, and there are 43 headstones there. It was open. It was the one that preceded this one. So Roger and I are working. That's a whole nother presentation of what happened in that cemetery. This one, most of the people, if they were buried here and there's no headstone, a lot of them were moved to the main cemetery that's still active on County Road 39 because family wanted to be together. So like Captain Mercator Cooper, who was a huge whaling captain, very famous, first Englishman in Japan. He was buried here, and then they moved his stone. I don't know if they took his body, but they moved his stone with the rest of the Cooper family there because they wanted them all to be together.
The first structure in this time, you can see the rows are lined up in here. So you can imagine how each one of these pieces are down that far apart. There's every indication. We'll be able to find that out. We're looking at further. There's every indication that there's graves in these spaces. We're just not seeing on the top. But they're down low.
When they started interring people in there. This is Joseph Post's headstone. He died in 1721, and it's very hard to read because they didn't waste any space. If you'll notice, some of these older ones, they just, the word just kind of continues down. So it says Joseph Post, the first interred at this place, and I think place is spelled P-L-A-S. So we know that this is the first burial here. And so we have all sorts of different degrees of headstones. We've got this naysayer. These older headstones with a lot of this elaborate etching and carvings on them of skulls, and I think this is all about the afterlife, which was much more important than here on Earth. Things have totally done a whole 180, and we don't, they didn't talk. They talked about death because death was all around them. We don't talk about death. We talk about sex and things like that, and they didn't talk about that at all. So we kind of changed what's important, but our cemeteries are still sacred, and we're trying to protect them. So let me find. If you have questions, please ask. Know much else about Maria other than her birth, maybe not even her birth date, just her death date and how old she was, so we can kind of figure out when she died. But Mary Rogers, which she's not the only Mary Rogers in the town of Southampton. There are many, many, many Mary Rogers. But Mary, she tells us just about everything we want to know, or at least gets us in a really good position. So Mary, she was married twice. She talks about she was wife of John E. Fournier. She was the widow of Edwin Halsey. She is the daughter of Cephas and Eliza Rogers. So we know her maiden name, we know who she is, who her parents were. We know she was born on May 31st, 1885, or 35 rather, in Cemeteries, so we know where she's from. She says that she's asleep in Jesus, so we know that she was religious. And she died after... she died before, but she left him a space here on the side. So we know tons about her. Unfortunately, not everybody did headstones that were like this. So I don't know if she did it or her second husband did it for her. But it's really a remarkable stone, and it's so well preserved. This granite is really great. Any questions? No?
No, I do.
I'm talking so fast. Yeah.
Did families buy plots in here?
They did, and I think they've taken up a lot of the little fencing that would have been around, like a family plot, like they would have done, like sometimes you'll see, I was just looking to see if there's any of those little squares that have initials on them so that you knew where a family plot is. So when you're doing some research on somebody, always look to the left and to the right, even if the names are not the same, because it usually means that they're somewhat related to the people that are close by. Yep.
A question about the website. You asked about research. In 2006, the town had the University of Pennsylvania School for Archaeology and Cemetery come down here, and they looked at every one of the 1,700 graves that were anchored in the town. Every word on every stone is on the website. And the website you can find by Southampton Town Historic Burying Grounds. When you get into it, there's a search mechanism. It's a little tricky to use, but essentially you could use the text to find any word on any of the town cemeteries. So if you put at sea, you can see all the people that were buried at sea. The last name, first name, you could look. We also use that as a place to keep our records of what we do to restoration efforts. So every grave has a number. It's located in a particular cemetery. It's all cross-referenced. So that's what Julie referred to earlier. This type of information is critical for the future for the people that are not currently historic today, because they have the information now. It's just a question of what's going to happen the next 100 years. So we want them to adopt the same procedures so we can follow forward. You should all go to the website. We've had over 270,000 unique users who come to that website, so it's pretty cool.
Are you all from Southampton, or do you have family that are buried here? Yeah. I don't. I'm an interloper. But so there's some. If you could walk around here and kind of get a general idea just by reading what's on the headstones, what they thought was important for you to know about them. Like Mary here, all these like branches and things like that, and sometimes you'll see acorns. That's all life, and the acorn is the tree and the tree of life. So they're very orientated towards life, but they're talking about the after, the afterlife. One up there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's up there. I wanted to show some of the work that we do, the actual work of conserving and preserving some of these headstones that have had damage. I missed the obelisk. It's over there. There's the king obelisk. If anybody walks back up and wants to take a look, there's the king obelisk that had suffered some damage. It looks like this a little bit further up. And just showing how we've repaired it. Yeah, so here we go. So these are not just, these are boundary marks, and they would have had a pole or some sort of wood or something. I'm not sure what they used, but this would be the family plot. So we have the Marshalls, and then there would have probably been headstones here. That may be one that have missed. There's the Randalls are on the outside. So this would be the Marshall plot. And unfortunately, we don't have any of the records for this cemetery. So we don't have records for any of the cemeteries, who's buried where, but the newer cemeteries that were, from the 1880s throughout the town have pretty decent records. The earlier cemeteries we don't. We just know from who's here. So those show wealth.
Like Christian burial ground, right? Was there any restrictions or denomination that was?
We don't have any of the town-owned cemeteries. We don't. They're basically Christian cemeteries. There's no. They don't say that that's what they are, but because of the time period and the people that settled this area and their descendants would have been of the Christian faith. There was a Jewish cemetery on 114 between Sag Harbor on the way out to East Hampton. So there's a Jewish cemetery, the Catholic cemetery, there's a Catholic cemetery in Sag Harbor, as well as this big Southampton cemetery right next door is the Catholic cemetery. But most of these people would have been Christian faith. I've looked through. We were looking for a tankard that was done by I.S. Pelletreau, the silversmith, and we were trying to figure out the initials on the top, who it was, and it's a V, so we kind of think it's a Dutch, a Von, something like that, and we couldn't find anybody in here with anything related to those initials. So, but we're always looking to see if there's some headstone that tells us something a little different, but right now these are pretty much a lot of the descendants of the early settlers, and they're offshoots of their family. I mean, we're down here now, and there's another a sayer.
The little stones in front of the bigger stones.
So these are the footstones. They're just close up to the headstones so that they don't get hit by the lawnmowers. They normally would be here, showing the body. I don't know if you heard originally, but the bodies are orientated head here. So it's almost kind of like you're laying on a bed and resting and waiting for the second coming. So, yeah, you can see some people came through and did repair work because a family member had come in and done repair work prior to the town taking over the cemetery. This is wonderful because it's keeping the headstone up off the ground, but we don't recommend using cement. We don't recommend any of that stuff. So there's all sorts of new technologies. We use a product called D2, which is a biodegradable enzyme. It's a solution that we use. We spray it on the headstone, especially the marble. It does wonders to the marble. We spray it. We walk away, and in 3 months they're bright white and exactly as they were when the person got buried. So
the surface of a maintenance schedule too. I'm going to set a regular schedule each day. Yes.
So the town goes through quite a bit of effort to maintain the cemeteries and respect those that are buried here. They're all part of our history. Does everybody kind of know the history of Southampton? Just the beginning part of our history. So so a group of about 8 families left Lynn, Massachusetts. They bought 8 miles square piece of property. And the original property that they bought was from Canoe Place eastward to the East Hampton line, all up into Sag Harbor and North Haven. They came from Lynn, Massachusetts. It was basically wanting a new place to settle, kind of finding out more that it was more really a business. They invested in this property. There's a gentleman named James Farrett. He was kind of the first realtor on Long Island. He was hired by, or a friend of Lord Stirling, who Lord Stirling was given Long Island by the king at the time in 1630s, and he began to sell it. And he hired James Farrett to be his realtor, and he went around to all the neighboring colonies up in Hartford and New Haven, went up to Lynn and Boston, and found people that were willing to buy in to kind of come and settle here. So there were about 8 families that came: Halsey, Sayer, Howell, Daniel Howe. He was actually the gentleman that they hired to take all their stuff, bring them by ship. Daniel Howe actually left Southampton and settled East Hampton in 1648. So he was here for about 8 years, and then he kept moving and doing more real estate deals. So, and then there were about four gentlemen that didn't stick around. They kind of left sometime between 1640 and 1648. They either went back. Most of them went back to Lynn, Massachusetts, is where they originally had settled. For one reason or another, we're not quite sure. Those are all things. As soon as we got all these COVID restrictions lifted, we have lots of field trips planned to go to Lynn and find out what records they have that tell us of the families that came here and settled here. So that's kind of how we got started. And as those families grew, more people came in, more people bought land, and this is kind of the 3rd and 4th generation of settler families that are buried here in this cemetery. And this cemetery went from about 1721 to about 1940, I think was like the last interment. The cemetery that's still active here in Southampton, they opened up in 1885, I believe they opened up. They needed more room. Nothing was ever done, and that's one of our challenges with our oldest burying ground off Little Plains, is that there's only 43 headstones in the cemetery. It's 2 acres, so it's just a big field and a smattering of headstones. It was opened in 1640 and all the way up until 1721, and we know many more people are buried there. So they didn't open this one because that one was full. That's what it would have happened. So we know that one was full. We just don't have any. We're just kind of working backward to figure out the clues of why that cemetery is so empty of headstones.
The cemetery is arguably the first municipal set-aside cemetery. Everybody was preceded here.
So, and the last headstone I wanted to bring you to, because it's really important. It's important to the town of Southampton. It's Piers Conser. Is anybody familiar with Piers? Heard about him? He was an African American. He was born into slavery here in Southampton Town. Most people don't realize, and when we talk about slavery, you always think Southern states. Slavery, New York State was one of the largest, I think the largest state, a northern state in the country for slavery. So New York State took advantage of the whole slavery model that the South was using on the plantations. But Pierce Conser lived here on, as I mentioned, he was born into slavery. Became a free man, and I had mentioned Captain Cooper earlier, Peter Cooper, who went to had gone on a whaling ship that rescued shipwrecked Japanese crew. And the reason they were able to get into Japan was completely isolated. No foreigners were allowed in. Pierce was on that ship with him. He was whaling with Cooper, and they rescued these Japanese. They came in. The Emperor of Japan gave them the authority to come in to drop off these whalers, these Japanese fishermen. And Pierce was supposedly the first African American that the Japanese had ever seen. Pretty amazing. They thought they rubbed his skin to see. So he traveled the world, not as a tourist, but on a whaling ship, which is not. The museum had a great talk about African American whalers, and I don't know how many times did he say that it was worse than being in prison to work on a whaling ship. So if you're an African American working on a whaling ship and it was prison for everybody else, it would even be that more horrific for you. So Pierce is a pretty special guy. He came back to Southampton Village. He had gained his freedom, and he worked on Lake Avalon. He would take people. He lived right across the street on Pond Lane, and he took people from the village out to the dunes. And he was a philanthropist. He gave his money away to charity. And he's buried here with his children. I think he outlived everybody in his children and his wife. And you can read the top of it, which is quite an epitaph and very fitting for Pierce. And his wife Rachel. I think Rachel might have been a Williams. Do we know? The Williams lived next door.
No,
Not
because
sure.
the Williams were his maternal family.
Maternal family. Okay.
He had an aunt with the same name. It was very confusing.
Right. Yeah, right. So, but it's important to know our African American history here in the town of Southampton. We had slavery. Some of the not large families didn't own large. I think the largest was probably William Floyd and Mastic. Surely he had probably a few dozen enslaved people. Southampton, most of the wealthy people had enslaved at least 3 to 5 families.
There's a slave cemetery up in out in Greene.
Yeah. There's marked, and I know on Shelter Island at Sylvester Manor, they had a large enslaved population working on that farm, and they have a separate burial ground for them as well. And in Bridgehampton, actually in Sagaponack at the Pups Bog, which is at the top of Sagmain and Montauk Highway, there's a cemetery there. There used to be the town's poorhouse used to be in Sagaponack. And there is an area of the town poor that were buried in that cemetery, as well as, ex-slaves that are there as well. So we don't have anything marked. He was a community member, treated quite differently. Question? Yeah.
You look at the wills, quite a few of these people were buried here.
Yeah.
The wills, you see.
Yeah. They were just property. And they were passed down in wills as an inheritance to their family members, or given freedom at that time too. So they were manumitted, is what the term is at that time. So, but New York State abolished slavery by 1827-ish. Yeah. But Pierce, his parents were slaves, so he was born into slavery. So he served until he was 18.
Between 1821, it's fuzzy.
Yeah. Not quite sure. The records are, so he has a great record. So, and we can learn from his headstone a lot about him, and it's preserved, and we will take excellent care of it.
He didn't have to purchase his freedom. He was just legally.
Yes, he was legally. Yes, so if you were born in, you had to stay until you were of an adult age, and you could take care of yourself. That was kind kind of the reasoning was when they manumitted you, as long as you could take care of yourself, provide for your family, then you wouldn't be a burden on the town, so they would give you your freedom. And there were some incredible stories of enslaved people gaining their freedom and going on to do incredible things here in the town.
So adults would gain their freedom, but their
No,
children
their children would
still
be in
remain
servitude,
slaves?
yeah.
They'd have to leave them where?
No, they could be with them, but they would, and you have to remember that they're with a family, and they normally would stay near that family, and the child would be in servitude, yeah.
A really good example of that is actually Pierce's grandfather,
Right.
Gad Williams. He gained his freedom in 1803, going on a whaling venture, and so he purchased his freedom for himself and his wife, but his children, which one of whom was Pierce's mother, were still enslaved to the Cooper family, which lived just far that way by the library is today.
Right,
And
the big
they,
white, that's Captain Cooper.
yeah, and Gad and his wife Esther continued to live right there with them until they also got their freedom as they got older.
As they got older, right. Thank
No problem.
So does anybody else have any questions?
I have one question.
Yeah.
Sorry, the settlers who came to Conscience Point, why did they come all this way to the middle of Southampton to start the town? Why didn't they stay closer to the water where they need?
Well, they did. North Sea became their port, which most people don't really realize, that North Sea was kind of the port where they came and went. Their shipping port, everything was brought in through North Sea when they first settled here. They followed, the Native Americans met them, and they followed them into probably a settlement that already pre-exists. It was already a Native American settlement.
Here?
Yes, in the village. The Native American population was pretty decimated. Probably 20 years prior, there was a plague that killed quite a bit of the Native American population in New England. They were very nomadic, so they kind of traveled back and forth, and so the Shinnecock tribe was pretty decimated at the time when they settled, and they needed protection. They were always warring with the Connecticut. The Pequots were always warring with the Shinnecock, and when the settlers came, part of the bargain, so to speak, was to for protection. So they came with guns and ammunition, and they were able to protect. So they were working on all of when they first settled in the first few years, exactly what happened here. And we're getting that picture, is that they lived together, and it may have been, this is still prime real estate, and it was then too. And that's where where they settled with the Indians, to be close by. And the settlers came, and they're just in the wilderness here. There's nothing. They're building houses to live in. They're digging cellars to live in during the first cold winter, to protect. So there's a sense that they all live together in the same area.
You have to stay too.
Yeah, you have to stay too. Part two, yeah. And people always just with roads and things here, any of the straight roads, those are roads that settlers put in. Anything that winds up to North Sea, those are Indian trails. So they just basically kind of followed the Indian trails. They're all along the water. They didn't reinvent where to drive. They continue with those trails. They just widen those. And most of the trails are run all along the water's edge, because the Indians, the Native Americans had their area, their winter camps and their summer camps. Their summer camps were all on the water. They did all their fishing and hunting on the waters, which is why we've discovered some, remnants of Indian native villages along the water. Yeah, we own the town owns a piece of property in Hayground, where the Hayground Cove comes up. Does everybody remember the St. James Hotel in Hayground? Yeah. Was originally the Rogers House. They wanted to build, I believe it was condos, and then when they started excavation, they found remnants of an Indian Native American settlement, and the town bought the property to preserve it. Yeah. and that's right on the water.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, anybody else? Any questions?
Thank you.